This is the Straight Up Breakdown Podcast.
Exclusively on the Herd Out Media Network.
Tell it to me straight up.
Hello, and welcome into the Straight Up Breakdown Podcast, proudly part of the Hail Varsity Network. I am Greg Smith, your New Year refocused me, even though it's strange to fully be back at work friend. Today I'm joined by Hail Varsity word writer Derek Peterson, my boy. Derek, welcome back to the show. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I still have my Christmas tree up. So that tells you kind of the start that I've gotten to my new year. Though I was able to spend like 6 hours last night deep cleaning my kitchen. My mother-in-law is coming to town. And so there cannot be dust anywhere because she's like me and she'll notice. Okay, so
I feel your pain because I had the same situation before Christmas. My mother-in-law came to visit and we deep cleaned everything. It made me feel really good about where we are to start the new year because it's still very clean everywhere in here. So it ended up working out. But our Christmas tree never went up.
What?
This year we didn't put it up. So originally we were not going to be here, and then we got really busy. And then we're like, oh, well, we looked up and it was like December 10th. And my wife Kim goes, so do you really want to put this up for a handful of days? And we still thought we were going to see our family. We ended up not. And so we did not actually put the Christmas tree up. We put some decorations out, and that was basically it. It seems sad, but it worked for us. It worked. There was still Christmas cheer around here.
I'm not here to judge anyone for doing what works for them.
But you're going to judge me.
I'm not going to judge. I've just never heard of somebody not putting up a Christmas tree. It makes sense though, why you wouldn't in this particular situation, but it's still strange.
It felt weird, to be honest. And then over the last couple of days, it feels like everyone has been talking about de-Christmasing their house. And all we had to do was take a little bit of decorations from upstairs, bring it to the basement. And that was it.
It's funny what people's timetables are when it comes to post-Christmas stuff coming down. There are people that I know that are the night of Christmas, everything's coming down. There are people that I know who will leave their tree up until February.
Yeah, same here. It's a wide range of things. I typically am okay leaving it till that to New Year's. About there is about where I want to go ahead and take it down. But I think that everybody wants to get all the joy that they can. So if you want to leave it up, you leave it up. It's more power to you.
Yeah.
Now, every week we have a couple of segments that are mainstays of the show. The first one is called Coach Speak, where we go over something that a coach, player, or talking head said, and then we give you the straight up breakdown of what they meant. I'm already laughing, and I've been looking forward to this because this week it comes courtesy of ESPN broadcaster Kirk Herbstreit, who had this to say. I'm sure you heard it over the weekend.
Coach, speak to real talk.
Quote, what's the difference as a player in saying these games are meaningless, Herbstreit said. Des, we played in meaningless games. I know you guys were here a lot here as in Pasadena for the Rose Bowl. I just don't understand it. I just don't understand if you don't make it to the playoff, how is it meaningless to play football and compete? Isn't that what we do as football players? We compete. So I don't know if it's changing or expanding the playoff. I just think that this era of player doesn't love football.
Let's break that down.
Derek, what does that mean?
Simpsons meme, old man yells at cloud. It's veering into that territory a little bit. I think there are a bunch of different ways that we could go and talk about this. And I think we could talk about this for an hour because there are several different branches. Herbstreit clearly wants more football, more meaningful football. He clearly enjoys watching football. As an observer who also enjoys watching football, would I have liked to see Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave in the Rose Bowl? Yes, obviously. Do you want to see some of the best players in games that have a legacy? Yes. Would it have been cool to see Kenneth Walker, Kenny Pickett in the Peach Bowl? Yeah. But then you see Matt Corral get hurt in the Sugar Bowl. And even if it doesn't have a long-term impact on his NFL career or a short-term, even if it doesn't have a short-term impact on his NFL draft status, it is still, he got hurt in a consolation game. And I think that's what we should call it. I don't think we should call it a meaningless football game. I think we should call it a consolation football game. ESPN they had all but one bowl game this postseason.
Yep.
There was one bowl game, the Sun Bowl, between Washington State and Central Michigan, that was on CBS. Everything else is on ESPN or an ESPN-owned property. They have a vested interest in those games being as attractive as possible. Therefore, their talking heads have a vested interest in those games being as attractive as possible. But it's just one of those things where I don't think that somebody who played in 1989 to 1992, which is when Kirk was a quarterback for the Ohio State Buckeyes, can compare his experience in college football in this particular instance to college football today. So I looked up some numbers from when Kirk played, and Des Howard, who made comments on this as well, which we can get into. I think he said some dumber. I'm going to go with stupider because it's fitting than Kirk. But so they were in college. Des was in college from 1989 to 1991, Kirk until 92. In 1989, there were 18 bowl games. Only one participating team had more than 4 losses. There were 19 bowl games the next year. In 1991, there were 18 bowl games. 1992, there were 18. In both of those years, there were only 3 participating teams that had more than 4 losses. 3 in the 18 games. Not counting playoff games this year or the national championship. There will be 41 bowl games. Not counting Rutgers, which was a replacement team and came in at 5-7, I believe. They finished 5-8. Not counting them, there were 40 participating teams in this year's bowl season that had more than 4 losses entering their bowl game. 40. So if you want to talk about what bowl games meant in 1992, that's fine. But you have to acknowledge that what bowl games meant then is significantly different from what they mean now for a number of teams. And the employer that you work for has a significant hand in that change. And just the other thing that I will say, nobody cares about an opt-out in the Hawaii Bowl. Kirk Herbstreit doesn't care about an opt-out in the Sun Bowl or the Cheez-It Bowl or the Duke's Mayo Bowl. He doesn't care about that. The only reason we're talking about this is because a couple of Ohio State players decided to sit out the Rose Bowl. That's the only reason he was talking about it. Let's make no mention of the fact that Devin Lloyd for Utah, who's probably going to be a top 10 selection in the draft, the 22 draft, this next draft, played that Rose Bowl game because he said he wanted to. The biggest problem with Kirk's comments was that he painted with too broad a brush, which I feel like tends to be the issue with those national talking heads a lot. And I think part of that is ESPN just puts them in positions where they are more vulnerable to saying dumb stuff. But like, Kirk's thing was just dumb. Desmond Howard's comments were frustrating, very frustrating.
Yeah, and I think that there is something to be said too, and I'm glad you kind of went there with the breakdown of how many bowl games there were then versus now, and kind of the changing calculus on what these bowl games actually mean, because I do think that there's something here there's a particular I don't want to say I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but it feels like there is a particular like age group of talking head and sports writer that holds on to the way that these bowl games used to have such great importance, or what they used to mean to the collective sport. And it is ironic in a lot of ways that ESPN, Kirk Herbstreit's employer, has had such a huge hand. And if you want to say, I don't want to say making bowls meaningless, because I don't necessarily know what they are, like at least devaluing what the bowl games used to mean. Like, I think that that's kind of hard to argue at this point, that bowl games are devalued. And they just mean a lot different things to different people. Like Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave were not going to, like, they didn't have as much to gain from a big performance in that Rose Bowl, or even performing at all in that Rose Bowl, as they maybe would have previously. Also, as I even think about that point about guys like Olave and Garrett Wilson, is that they also don't need that game anymore for exposure, right? It used to be that that if you saw Ohio State in that Rose Bowl, that maybe was your first opportunity to see those guys. If you were in another part of the country, right? Because you're going to see it's a nationally televised ABC game. And it's kind of the same way I feel about the Heisman. That's part of the reason why I think the Heisman has lost a little bit of mystique, because you see these guys all year long. And so it's the same principle, where I don't think that because the exposure is so great, those guys don't need that stage anymore to announce themselves. When we saw both of them destroy, say, Indiana on ESPN or ABC or whatever, you know what I mean? Like it happened already. We saw them on a nationally televised game multiple times because they played Ohio State. And so I think that the generalization about like today's player and how they don't love football as much is something that tends to now come up a lot. It comes up all over the place. And I think it comes up subtly, and it comes up not so subtly in this case with Kirk Herbstreit and his comments. But if you think about it, it comes up here locally when Scott Frost says at a press conference, we need to find guys that love football. While, yes, that's obviously true, he says it so much that it feels like he's kind of saying, by not saying, that guys in this generation, it's harder to find the ones that do love football, right? Like it comes up all the time. And so I do think that that's a generalization. But then at the same time, like you mentioned the kid from Utah that played, like he played, Matt Corral played, and had also the thing about him is that he made his statement before the game about how he just had to play in that game and he couldn't let his teammates down, and he, you know, blood, sweat, and tears with all of them. And I remember the only reason I know that is because I saw it plastered all over the place. The SEC Network picked it up, ESPN picked it up. It was all over the place. Then the kid gets hurt. And it was, oh, it's not going to affect his draft stock. Quarterbacks still get drafted in the first round. And I'm just like, it immediately went to excuse making. That's what I heard that all over.
That was the thing that was said?
Oh, I read that all over the place. All over the place.
Are we working on like 5 straight drafts where a quarterback has gone number 1 overall?
Yeah. And so like, and so I'm just like, I don't understand that logic of how you're going to say that it's not going to affect him because guys bounce back. And they're like, well, Joe Burrow came back from a knee injury. And I'm just like, you just never know. Just because someone else came back from it doesn't mean that Matt wants to be in the position where he's going to have to do this. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, and so it's just interesting just seeing all of this unfold. And it's almost, to me, become this like interesting generational argument in a lot of ways as we kind of move through this.
Yeah, I think one of the things that that is most frustrating for me is that, like, specifically with Matt Corral's comments, it becomes this this either or thing where you hear a guy like Matt Corral say, well, I just wanted to be out there for my teammates. I couldn't picture myself not playing in this game. Devin Lloyd said something similar leading up to the Rose Bowl. And it becomes this thing where it's like them saying that reflects poorly on the guys who didn't say that, who made the opposite decision. When that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, it doesn't need to be an either or thing. but we've kind of twisted it into this thing where Matt Corral saying, I need to be out there for my teammates means that Garrett Wilson opting out says that he doesn't care about his teammates. That's not true. That's not the way that this works. I think there's also another issue at play where, like, I just think some of the old folks in college football media, they just don't have a firm grasp of like of everything that goes into playing college football right now. Like Kirk and Desmond Howard talking about, well, back in my day, 20 years ago, you didn't play this many games. School probably wasn't as tough for you then as it is now for a lot of these guys. With the COVID year, you have to factor in that a lot of these guys are working on master's degrees right now. Right. That's an element of it. And then there's just all of this other stuff that is on a college athlete's plate right now, specifically high profile football players with NIL. And you can roll your eyes at NIL and say, oh, well, I don't like it, or it shouldn't be the way that it is, or players shouldn't be focused on that in season, but they are. It's just the fact of the matter.
It's a changing of the time, like a resistance to changing with the times, right? And it's so wild to see this unfold because, and as you're saying, like, oh yeah, well, back in my day with Herb Street and Dez, like, man, that may as well have been 100 years ago. It wasn't. But it may have well been, considering how different college athletics are right now. And then honestly, if you fast forward another 20 years, how much more different it's going to be, right? Like, I think that it's also the resistance to players having more agency over what they do, because the people that also, it seems like the people that don't like the bowl opt-outs, don't like NIL, don't like transfers, all of the stuff, all the new stuff that's in the bucket to help players, right? And to help them have more agency and be able to have more control over their futures. It are things that it feels like people are really, really resistant to. And there is a weird contrast with how then Lincoln Riley is on set, and those guys could not have fallen over themselves more to basically make excuses for him and what he did to Oklahoma. Like, and so it's just been, it's this weird catch-22. And we're in a time now where I noticed that during the show, but there are current college football players that were saying that on social media, right? Like, we're also in this time where people can now get their voice and opinion out there. And so that guys are feeling some type of way about this, and they see what they feel, and I agree, is hypocrisy in the situation.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's a wonderful point. And I it does seem like, I don't know if it's jealousy on the part of guys that former players that didn't get to experience this, or didn't get to have this same kind of magnitude of voice, or what it is. But like, it does seem like as a player's agency over his future, his image grows, the old folks in the profession just get more annoyed. Yeah, I mean,
I just also think that there's a real tight holding on to of that, of the idea that college football is supposed to be more pure, though we have like so many examples of why it never has been. Like, I mean, we're not making 30 for 30s and watching them and enjoying them about teams that were so pure and like boring, right? Like, we're watching 30 for 30s on Miami and the Pony Express and all of that stuff, right? USC and those sorts of things. Like, we're not, like, it's just so interesting that in Oklahoma, like, we just have all of these different examples of the sport never was quite as pure as people want to make it out to be, yet they're still holding on to this ideal. Or really, is it that it's not like out there in the open? Like, I could never quite put my finger on what that ideal is that it seems like people are really holding on to about kind of the purity of college football, because you hear it from fans sometimes too, when they say like, the reason I like college football more than the NFL is because it's the love of the game. It comes up a lot more in college basketball, it feels like, but it comes up in college football as well. And I can never quite understand when exactly that time was, because pre-Dez and Herb Street times, if you think about, say, like Eric Dickerson, right? For some reason just rolled into my mind. Like, he didn't get there to SMU by like the love of the game. Like, it's just always interesting to me how that plays out.
Yeah. The other piece, there was something that didn't sit right with me with Herb Street being the one to make those comments Saturday morning and then getting to enjoy the Rose Bowl that played out. Because the other piece of this is, if Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave play in the Rose Bowl, Jackson Smith and Jigba doesn't do what he did. That was probably, it's not USC Texas at the Rose Bowl, but that was probably one of the most enjoyable college football games I have ever watched. It's probably one of like the best Rose Bowls that's been played. And that performance from Jackson Smith and Jigba was probably one of the best by a wide receiver in the history of college football's postseason. Like, is that not what this is supposed to be about? Like, next man up, take advantage of your opportunity. Isn't that what this is like supposed to be? Isn't that what like old heads like Kirk Herbstreit are championing? Is guys going out and doing that?
It should be, because I actually think that's a good point. I'm glad you brought it up, because I wanted to make sure to say that and I forgot, is that that's the part of this that I actually really enjoy. Like, I actually think a guy like Kenneth Walker not playing in this game playing in his bowl game gives an opportunity to someone else to shine or get a jump start on their development for the next season, because you're going to need that guy going forward. It introduces the next group of stars, right? Yeah. And so I just don't, like, to me, and maybe it's just my outlook on this whole thing, is to either A, find the silver lining, or B, it doesn't really rile me up to the point of being angry that guys are opting out. And I'm not going to say that they're less teammates or they love football any less because of this, because, oh, by the way, if they didn't love football, they wouldn't be opting out to get ready to play more football, like, because that's what they're doing. Like, they're opting out so they can get ready to prepare for the NFL draft to then go play professional football. So it's just a whole strange thing, but it's not going away. Like, this conversation will continue to go, I think, as the years go on and more guys opt out.
Well, yeah, if we keep adding ridiculous bowl games like the Barstool Sports Arizona Bowl that's only going to be streamed on Barstool's website, people don't want to play in that game.
Right.
Nobody wants to play in that game. That's why Central Michigan left that game at the first opportunity. This was a really good line from Ralph Russo's piece for the AP. I wrote some notes down. This was Russo's writing. It was a tone-deaf statement from Kirk Herbstreit insisting a new generation holds the same sentimentality for traditions that he has, even though those traditions have been watered down for years by the adults who run college football. And I'm sorry to keep going back to the Rose Bowl, but it's just, that's what Herbstreit was talking about. It's where he was. And it also, with Utah being in it, it was the perfect kind of juxtaposition of situation. Utah was playing in its first ever Rose Bowl. Never been there before. All week leading up, the talk was about how this was a culmination of years and years of hard work on the part of Utah and the part of head coach Kyle Whittingham. They were in the Mountain West Conference a decade ago. Now they're in the Rose Bowl, and they played freaking Ohio State right down to the wire. They wanted to be there because they won the Pac-12. There was really no realistic shot at all at any point in the season for them to make it into the college football playoff. They started 1-2. On the other side, you have Ohio State, who up until November 27th thought, yeah, we're going to the college football playoff. And then they lose to Michigan. And now suddenly they're completely out of it. The season-long goal that they had, their goal wasn't to play in the Rose Bowl.
Right.
Like, that team's goal was not to play in the Rose Bowl. So now you lose to Michigan, and all of a sudden you're in the Rose Bowl. You're not in the college football playoff, even though that team felt like it had a championship team and it had title aspirations, and they're not there. Now add in season-long programming that the college football playoff is all that matters. How many college football playoff ads did we get during bowl games leading up to the playoff semifinals? They were nonstop. They were incessant. We're constantly talking about the playoff. And even in the postseason, we're constantly talking about the playoff. And at ends of bowl games, instead of talking about what's happening, we're talking about the players that are on the field or what's coming next for the teams that are playing. We're talking about how Georgia's defense can slow down Michigan, or how Georgia compares to Alabama. That's the problem. So you cannot spend all year long talking about how, well, how's this team going to get to the playoff? Well, how does this impact the playoff? Well, how does that impact the playoff? And then when you reach the non-playoff games, say, why does nobody care about this? That's not how it works. It's also, I wrote this down in my notes too. It's also worth pointing out that 20 years ago, when Kirk Herbstreit was playing, a former quarterback whose best season was tossing 4 touchdowns against 6 interceptions wouldn't be making $2 million a year to commentate on football. Football is a cash cow for everyone but the players. Now, to be clear, I think Kirk Herbstreit is pretty good at what he does. But my question to Herbstreit and then Desmond Howard would be this: would you be willing to do your job for free with 0 protections from your employer? And if you weren't willing to do that, would it be fair to criticize your commitment to that employer or to that job? Now, I know it's not a perfect example because there is really like no perfect facsimile for college football. It's a game that you have to love first and foremost to put up with everything that is required of playing. Like AJ Forbes on Twitter put this really well. Football weeds out the players that don't love it in the offseason. If you get to the season in college football at the FBS level, I'm not just talking about like Big Ten SEC level. I'm just talking about FBS, plain and simple. If you're playing Division I FBS football, you care about football. To suggest that someone like Garrett Wilson or Kenneth Murray or Kenny Pickett doesn't love football because they've opted out of, again, a consolation game is just beyond absurd to me. And I'd be curious to see, if you go through and look at opt-outs, how many of the guys that are actually opting out of bowl games end up being 1st or 2nd round draft picks? How many opt-outs do we get for guys that go on to become 7th round selections?
Right.
Or 6th round selections? Like, we're talking about the top end of the draft, where if you fall from the 1st round to like the 3rd or the 4th round, there's a sizable difference in what that contract is going to look like when you first sign it.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And one of the things, and you hit on it a little bit, so I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I wanted to make sure to ask you, is that related to all of that, and knowing that we've seen like just nonstop barrage of playoff advertisements and talks and shows, like, are the bowl games meaningless? Like, do you think that they're meaningless? Have you enjoyed them on the whole so far?
Those are 2 different questions with 2 different answers. Yes, I think bowl games are meaningless. Yes, I have enjoyed them. As an observer, as a viewer, as somebody that just wants to watch college football, I enjoy bowl season. I enjoy being able to wake up on December 26th and have a bowl game at 11 a.m. and then watch football throughout the rest of the day, and then go to sleep, wake up the next morning and do the same thing over again. I enjoy that. That being said, we don't need a Duke's Mayo Bowl.
Hey, don't be picking on the Mayo Bowl.
We don't need that bowl game. But my point is, what's the point of that bowl game? The point of that bowl game is for ESPN to advertise Shane Beamer getting mayonnaise dumped on his head. That's the point of the bowl game.
Which is, but I remember about that game, like the only reason I remember that they won that is because I can picture the video of him getting mayo dumped on his head.
If teams weren't given an extra 15 practices for competing in a bowl game, let's say they got 3 the week of. Let's say your regular season ends, you get a couple weeks off, and then you get to go to the site of a bowl game, practice a couple times, and then play again. How many teams would participate in bowl games?
Oh, I think you'd have a lot more team opt-outs in that case, because then you might as well just go get started, like go get some rest, get started on your winter conditioning, and just get it going that way.
When teams talk about how important a bowl game is to them, do they talk about how much they want to win the Nashville Music City Bowl trophy, or do they talk about how much they want those 15 practices?
Oh, it's all about the practices. We hear about that a lot.
Right. It's not about the game. It's about the practices leading up to it. If you offered teams 15 practices at the end of their season, between the start of December and the end of the year, the calendar year, and said, you can take these, but you don't have to play in a bowl game, I bet 90% of teams would take those practices and not play in the game so that they could send their kids home for Christmas.
Yeah. And
unless it was like the Rose Bowl, the Fiesta Bowl, like the games that have traditional power legacies, teams want to play in those games because you grew up watching those games and you know about those games. But some of these other games, they are meaningless.
So they would want to play, but the key question though is, do you still get the bowl gifts? Because like the Fiesta Bowl, they got PS5s, right?
Did they?
I think so. That's the one that's sponsored by PlayStation, because that was one of the other things that was hilarious about all of this is Herb Street's ranting and raving about the how like we've lost tradition and the old school stuff, and I miss that, blah blah blah. Kids don't love football. But let me cut to this commercial for the PlayStation Fiesta Bowl. Because he also said like so I forget, was it Herb Street that also said the comment about video games? I don't know. One of them said like it all runs together. And so then we cut to the commercial for the PlayStation Fiesta Bowl. But the bowl game gifts are important in this too. But I do think that if you just took the 15 practices and let them have, I definitely think that 90% of college football teams would just elect to have the practices and not do the bowl game. Right.
Except for, the handful of, the rose, the Fiesta, the orange. And that on its own means that the rest of them are meaningless. Yeah. That the rest of them, and I don't, I keep saying meaningless. I'll call them consolation games because like it's still game reps. Jackson Smith and Jigba probably doesn't think that the Rose Bowl is meaningless. Some of the teams that played earlier in the bowl cycle probably don't think that their games are meaningless. But like that, I think that's just what it is. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Except for the fact, one of the other things that keeps this like struggle going is how much power and influences like bowl games and bowl partners have in college football. Like, you think about all the talk about expanding the college football playoff or even doing it in the first place. And remember, one of the big concerns was what is this going to do to bowl games? Like the bowl games don't want this to happen. There's also a reluctance, and I understand why they want their money, is that bowl games needing to be reconfigured or restructured or some type of change to that system is going to be met kicking and screaming by the actual bowl partners, which have an outsized amount of power in college football because of the way things used to be.
Yeah, 100%. Yep.
Now, every week we end the show with a topic that was our favorite topic, and Derek made an appearance on the Best Of. You should go check that out. It was last week's episode where he put old age on blast. And every week we end the show with our favorite segment called Put Them on Blast, where we basically put someone on blast for something that they did or said.
Put them on blast.
This week I'm going to go first. And I think that this is maybe the first time that technically 4 different people or entities that are all related need to go on blast. I'm putting Antonio Brown, the Bucks organization, Bruce Arians, and Tom Brady all on blast this week. I'm sure you've seen the video by this point. I'll link it in the show notes if you have not, of Antonio Brown. There's no other way to say it. He quit during the game yesterday. We recorded this on Monday. Sunday, that the Bucks had, and they coincidentally came back and won with another classic Tom Brady moment. But he quit during the game. There's all sorts of memes out there now because of the way that he left the field. There were posts from him on social media after the game, waiting for a cab. There was a post from the Uber driver with him in the Uber. There were reports that Antonio Brown had to get his own flight home because that's what tends to happen when you quit on your team in the middle of a game. The team cut him like basically during the game, because when Bruce Arians was asked about it after the game, he said that he didn't want to talk about Antonio Brown because he's no longer with the team. Tom Brady, for his part of it, said that, we don't know the things going on with Antonio, which may or may not be true. But the reason that all of them have to go on blast, obviously Antonio has to go on blast for this ridiculous behavior. You can't do that. Who does that? But the rest of them have to go on blast because they knew what this guy was when they signed him. When you brought him in, you knew what Antonio Brown was. He was drama, and really even more so than that, like he's been accused of sexual assault. He's had all sorts of things like problems with women in his life. He's been a bad teammate other places. Like this whole thing that, like, I don't want to say this exactly was the inevitable end of this, because who can foresee somebody just quitting in the middle of the game, ripping their jersey off and then running off the field? You never see that. But some sort of weird end was the inevitable end to this saga. And so for all of that, everyone associated with the Bucs organization, including Bruce Arians, who gave him a pass multiple times for things he did while in Tampa, including that fake vaccination card situation. All of you have to go on blast.
So did you see Ian Rappaport's, I think it was a report from this morning?
I did not see that.
So I'm curious if this changes your perspective at all.
Uh-oh.
He reported, I think on whatever the NFL Network's Good Morning Show is, that Bruce Arians and the offensive coaching staff for the Bucs asked Antonio Brown to go into the game. And Antonio Brown, who did not practice on Thursday or Friday, per Rappaport, for an ankle injury, did not feel like he was healthy enough to play and said, I'm not healthy enough to play. And Arians said, if you're not going to go into the game when we tell you to go into the game, then you need to leave the field. And according to Rappaport, because Antonio Brown said he did not feel that he was healthy enough to play, Arians told him on the field during the game that he was cut and that he was not going to be part of the team moving forward, and basically kicked him off the field. Now, that's just what Rappaport reported. And there's a bunch of people that are like, I mean, AB looked like his ankle was fine when he was jogging off the field and, going through the end zone and things like that, to which I would say I was able to run on a torn ACL. So sometimes that stuff happens. Now, he is a drama queen and everything you just said holds up. Yeah. He is not he doesn't seem to be a good person.
Right. I think that's a good point. Yes.
But if Arians was like, hey man, I don't care what you think about your body. If you're not going to play, then you can get off the field. It's not a good look. You probably could have handled that a little bit better. That wouldn't have been so drama inducing.
Yeah, I would say that would change. It actually would make me think worse of Bruce Arians, I guess. I still would not have obviously condone Antonio Brown doing that because he could have just left the field. He didn't have to leave like that. But boy, I'll be interested to see how that unfolds, because if you can get more confirmation on that, because I'm not even sure, a lot of times when you get these reports, my very first thought is always when you're trying to figure out where they come from, who benefits from that. And who benefits from that report being out there in that way? And I guess it's AB, it's Antonio Brown, but it's a bad look for everyone. I still think it would be a really bad look for everyone, even if that is correct. But it adds a layer of weird to the story. Derek, who are you putting on blast?
Desmond Howard. I know we spent the entire podcast talking about this, but I wanted to touch on Des, and we didn't get there, so I'm gonna do it now. This was his full comment after Kirk Herbstreit. He said, he agreed with Kirk and that he was going to bring up the not loving football thing. Quote, "We're dealing with a totally different mentality when we're dealing with student athletes nowadays. Their whole mentality right now is about the championship, the playoff. We've got to get into the CFP. And because of that, they don't value the bowl games. Now, when we were coming up, Herbstreit and myself, to go to a bowl game was a huge reward for a fantastic season. That's what it meant. Okay, your team played this well, so you're going to be rewarded by going to this bowl game. You're going to get a ring. You're going to get swag. Now, kids don't really care about that. They have a sense of entitlement, and it's like, if we're not going to the one that matters, then it just doesn't have as much value to them as it did to us growing up." So I already pointed out the drastic difference in how many bowls and the kind of team that makes a bowl game. So that's a piece of it. Desmond Howard's comments are far more ridiculous than Kirk Herbstreit's comments were, in my opinion. And he seems to be skirting criticism. Like, I haven't seen a ton of backlash to what Desmond Howard said, which probably goes to show that the vast majority of people just expect Desmond Howard to say stupid shit. A player is entitled, in Desmond Howard's view, because he doesn't care about a bowl game swag bag. A player is entitled, in Desmond Howard's view, because they don't hold the same value judgments as Desmond Howard. So here's an interesting little nugget. The average NFL salary in 1991, according to an article from the Baltimore Sun on December 27th of that year, was $422,000. The average NFL salary today is $2 million. That is life-changing money for people who are at college to play football and have a shot at making that money in the first place. Just because they are interested in turning football into a career doesn't mean they're any less in love with football. If there wasn't as much money to be made in football as there is, do you think that parents, knowing what they know now about head injuries, other bodily injuries, everything that comes into play with football, would let their kids sign up to play it? It's a risk assessment that in a large percentage of the football playing population, families make because of the potential payoff. Part of this is economic. And so Herbstreit and Dez's generation, they didn't have the same data on injury risk available to them that we do now. Football wasn't the cash cow that it is now. Of course, motivations have changed because literally everything else about football has changed from when they played to now. Like your comment about how, 20 years from now, it's going to look 180 degrees different even then. For Desmond Howard to call kids entitled because they are not playing in a game that he wants to watch them play, and instead focusing on potentially making a little bit more money or saving themselves from an injury so that they can make more money in the long run for their families, is ridiculous. He says some dumb stuff on ESPN sets, but this one just really bothered me. I don't, Kirk's is whatever, but to call kids entitled for saying, I don't want to play in this one bowl game after how many games did Garrett Wilson play for Ohio State? Like, it's got to be approaching 30.
Yeah, that's being that range.
Is absurd. And so for that, Desmond Howard has to go on blast.
And he
again, because it hasn't been the first time.
Yeah, again. And he absolutely deserves it because you were correct in everything you said. It's just, I do think the burying of heads in the sand by people like Dez and Kirk, Herbstreit, and others about the role that like ESPN and kind of and other entities too play in minimizing these other bowl games and saying that they only want. And it's also weird to say that they're entitled because they don't care about swag and they're entitled because they only care about championships is also just a weird statement. If you really just think about that they care about championships like that, as if that was a bad thing. But it's only a bad thing because you want to see them in these other games. Like,
that's also a creation of of our doing in the media.
Right.
Because we evaluate people based off of how many championships they won. We evaluate people based off of how many games that they won. So part of that is ESPN's fault too.
It is. It's a wild ride to really take yourself on and really think about how we got here and why. And then I promise, because I didn't see it live, but I would almost bet that after that segment aired, there was a playoff, some sort of playoff commercial or reference to it or the championship game in that commercial set, because there just has to be, because we saw them all over the place. It's just interesting to see that, just that part of it being ignored over and over again.
Yeah, 100%.
But hey, that's going to do it for us today. Subscribe to the podcast everywhere you listen to them. Rate us, review us, leave us a 5-star review. If you leave 4, I am inclined to think you're a hater, and nobody wants that, even in the new year. You want to start off fresh, not being a hater. Make sure you're checking out the other podcasts on the Hail Varsity Network, the Mind Your Own podcast, Varsity Club, Nebraska Preps Postgame Show, and the Hail Varsity Radio Show. Also, check out the Hail Varsity YouTube page. I'll be back on there this week with Steve Mark talking about recruiting question of the week. You can also get after us on Twitter at Greg Smith HB, at Dr. Petey HB. You can also email the show at straightupbreakdown@hailvarsity.com. I will catch y'all next week.
A Huda Media Production.